Hello and welcome to Insights with me, Lynne O'Donnell. My guest today is Natalie Gonnella-Platts. She's the Director of Global Policy at the George W. Bush Institute, which is part of the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Texas. She has extensive experience as a researcher on women's and children's rights, democratic backsliding, autocracy, and gender inequality. I talked to her about a series of reports that the Institute has just released called Captured State that take an almost forensic look at Afghanistan and what's happened to the country, to the people, and to women and girls since the Taliban returned to power in 2021. I must say that these reports are rare in that they make specific recommendations to the international community on what action could and should be taken to hold the Taliban accountable for the human rights abuses they commit with apparent impunity, in the hope that the new regime could be pressured into behaving like a proper government. Have a listen. Natalie Gonnella-Platts, welcome. It's my honour to be talking to you, and I'm very happy that you have joined me today. Can you please start by describing the series of reports that have been released by the George W. Bush Institute?
So the George W. Bush Institute continues to work on issues of importance to our leadership, both during their time in the White House in Washington, D.C., and what they call the quote-unquote afterlife here in Texas. And across all of the work that we do, we ground that work in freedom, opportunity, accountability, and compassion. Afghanistan has always been a core focus of our efforts since the Institute was founded. But as you can imagine, over the course of the last really 3 to 4 years, that work has grown significantly. And our report series, Captured State, really takes a look at the reality that is playing out on the ground every day, especially for vulnerable populations. And, I am so blessed to work in an institution that has such a robust diversity of expertise. I have colleagues who are anti-corruption and anti-kleptocracy experts. I myself exist within the gender equity space. And so we actually got to thinking about the fact that what the Taliban is doing is very, very much, the prime example of corruption, the prime example of kleptocracy. These two nefarious actions have been endemic in Afghanistan for decades. We have to acknowledge that, the role that, these actions played in what happened in 2021. But the fact that the Taliban are messaging themselves as, combating corruption, combating kleptocracy is entirely a false narrative. And what's even more concerning is the fact that the international community has done very little, not just to push against this narrative, but to hold the Taliban to account for their corruption and kleptocracy, which, has a human cost to it. And so often when we talk about corruption and kleptocracy within the global community, the populations that are affected by these bad actions very often are without a seat at the table, let alone acknowledgement in terms of what these actions do to them day in and day out. And in Afghanistan, it's very clear to see that it is women, children, as well as other vulnerable communities who are bearing the majority fallout of the Taliban's theft, the Taliban's exploitation, and the Taliban's capture of the state. And so our report series essentially aims to set a foundation documenting this. We look at how the Taliban are making and spending their money, what the human cost of that is, and then I think most provocatively, who are the international enablers, both state and non-state actors? And it's not just those who are, very obviously complicit and intentional in their actions, but those who, through their complacency, have become complicit. And I think that warrants a lot greater attention as well.
Natalie, you mentioned the lack of accountability and the way the Taliban is trumpeting itself as championing anti-corruption causes. And yet I speak to people in multilateral organizations, including the UN, who say that the Taliban is not as corrupt as the previous government, the Republic government. I don't think there's anybody on the planet who would deny that the Republic government was an incredibly corrupt one. But I don't think we're talking apples and apples. We're talking apples and oranges. It's corruption in a different way, isn't it? I mean, telling me that the evidence for the Taliban's lack of corruption is the fact that they charge all trucks crossing the border exactly the same amount of money to do so. It just doesn't wash with me, and there isn't any pressure for accountability about what actually happens to the money that is charged. And so I know that one of your reports was about enablers. I think that enabling is almost at every level, no?
Enablement is happening across the board, rightfully, as you say, every level. And to your point, I mean, corruption evolves. And yes, while it appears that, things are streamlined and more efficient in places like along the borders, where you only have to pay one individual as opposed to 20, right, to get a lorry into Afghanistan and on its way, that really needs to be dissected further. One, to the point on enablement, the Taliban need to make as much money as they possibly can for their own sustainability. It's part of the state. What is state capture is exploiting the state mechanisms and the state resources. And so you're going to want to make, the border situation as attractive as you possibly can for trade and foreign investment, because it aids your end goal. What requires greater scrutiny is, just as you said, where is that money going afterward? If the Taliban have collected record levels of tax and customs revenue, which so many different reports document across various news sources, why are, multilateral institutions, why aren't influencers across all levels really pushing on the Taliban to be more transparent about where that money is going? And the only reason we have some semblance of understanding of where that money is going is because there are a number of independent media outlets who bravely endure day in and day out, led by courageous Afghans who have shared some of that information. And so we know, a vast majority of that goes to things like intelligence and security, propaganda and the like. And if you look at how the Taliban is using the state apparatus for propaganda, for indoctrination, for, courting loyalists, it is incredibly concerning, not just in terms of the evolution of their use of corruption, but the impact that this will have longer term on not just regional, but global security.
Well, indeed, but there's also the aid theft and diversion. There was an awful lot of pushback on reporting about that by the very institutions that are allowing this to happen. Denial that the Taliban was diverting aid, and a lack of willingness to look at the Taliban, I think, as a body in itself that is intent on maintaining and entrenching its own power with its own identity. So, you've got that Islamist Pashtunness that by its very nature excludes women, we know, but other nationalities and other religions and sects. And so there has been an unwillingness, I think, by the international community and multilateral organizations to recognize that very definition of the Taliban movement.
Oh, so many points there that I want to unpack. To your first point, the emphasis on exclusion, not just exclusion, but let's call it what it is. It's persecution, right? Not just of women, but of minority populations, whether that be ethnic, religious, geographic, there are so many different, ways to unpack that. In addition to the concerning trend within multilateral spheres, for example, to praise the Taliban for their quote unquote ability to uproot corruption, I think it's highly concerning that they've also been applauded at times for their security, right? And their commitment to security. But when was the last time, you saw Taliban leadership speak out against the horrific atrocities regularly committed against the Hazara community, for example, right? Absolute carnage in terms of the bloodshed and the targeting that has taken place. It doesn't happen because it serves a purpose, right? It undermines a population that they, view in the way that they do. And, it is contrary to their goal of exploiting the state. And when it comes to things like the theft of humanitarian aid, the Hazara community very often is left without. Aid is not reaching, these minority populations who face some of the greatest vulnerabilities right now. Likewise, you look at the accounts that have been gathered across so many media sources and other reports, including the work that Sagar continues to undertake, and you hear just absolutely atrocious examples of the corruption that's persisting. The fact that the Taliban have registered hundreds, if not, well over 1,000 NGOs that have inserted themselves. I have heard over and over and over again from advocates that they have been who have organizations operating on the ground, that they have been pressured either to add Taliban loyalist families to aid distribution lists so that they can continue to reach, the communities they serve, or they have been pressured to include Taliban officials within their board or within senior leadership positions. There are accounts too. So Zara Nader, in the work she's doing at Zon Times, had an excellent report documenting a variety of ways, theft of aid is happening. And it includes even Taliban officials going door to door after aid has been distributed, whether it's, essential goods or cash payments, and literally taking back these items from families who are literally enduring hunger day in and day out, preventable and treatable illnesses, heating shortages and the like. And, they're quite literally stealing from children. And so, it may not be apparent, in terms of the immediate inflow of aid, but there are multiple opportunities across the ways in which aid is being distributed that the Taliban can utilize corrupt practices and essentially kleptocracy to steal. And they're doing exactly that. And that is why the perspectives of Afghans, particularly from diverse backgrounds, diverse communities, really warrants far greater recognition and far more visible and meaningful seats at decision-making tables. And that is still not happening at scale.
But Natalie, you and I know about this, and we've obviously known about it for some time. You've done these incredibly comprehensive and detailed reports and drawn on an awful lot of resources and sources to do so. I've been reporting on what's been going on in Afghanistan for a very long time, and very comprehensively, if I say so myself, since the fall of the Republic and the Taliban's return to power. So there is, in my mind, no excuse for no one to know. Everybody knows. And then you have people of integrity like Richard Bennett, who works for the UN, the Special Reporter on Human Rights, and the UN Security Council's Sanctions Monitoring Committee also does very comprehensive work on this. And Cigar, unbelievably good quality work for a long time. So why is it, in your view, that this isn't filtering up? Why does the United Nations continue to, accept, I'm trying to think of the right word, accept the Taliban's word for it? And why does UNOCHA continue to accept that this is their country now and this is how they're doing it? Why aren't things changing? Why is it okay to do this in Afghanistan when it wouldn't be okay in my country or your country?
So I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the fact that there's a lot going on in the world right now. So I want to recognize that, right? There's a lot of competing challenges, but the thing is, they're actually not competing. They're in many ways deeply connected. And, I think in a lot of ways, people still view Afghanistan as existing within an isolated vacuum, and that's certainly not the course. I think, what played out in Afghanistan, and just the chaos of the withdrawal in and of itself really inspired other autocrats. I think the fact that this isolated vacuum is occurring actually enables a lot of other bad actors, autocrats, extremists, the like, which is incredibly unfortunate and really warrants why we need to pay greater attention to what is happening and to really push against the Taliban's atrocities. But, I also think that people aren't quite sure what to do. And what was really interesting in, our work on this report, it actually started rather organically. We just started gathering breadcrumbs, right? Information that was out there that really no one was paying a lot of attention to. And we started to unpack it and link it together with other breadcrumbs, right? And we validated everything that we've documented within the reports. We utilized dozens and dozens of consultations with a wide array of advocates. And we started to see that there actually is a path that has not been pursued. And while many in the international community, I think, are just becoming tired and impatient with the status quo, right, which allows us to, which is encouraging us, I should say, quite concerningly, to see this slow but steady inching towards normalization, which we at the Bush Institute view as, normalization is dehumanization, and it's unacceptable, frankly. But actually, there are a lot of anti-corruption, anti-kleptocracy mechanisms that are on the table that haven't been utilized. And the other thing that we found that I think, to the point, the root of your question, what I've found and was quite surprised by is that, a lot of people have a really, what's the right word? Vague understanding of what the actual existing penalties are that have been in place for a long time. I think folks think that these are far more robust than they actually are. And so we also found that there's a huge education opportunity in underscoring that there's actually a lot of low-hanging fruit. And amid the human suffering that endures in Afghanistan day in and day out, as a result of the Taliban's atrocities, but also, the resulting economic crisis, that in a lot of ways, I think John Sopko said, he sees a lot of Taliban who remain fat, dumb, and happy, right? Like they're not feeling the pain of the economic crisis. And so at a time when they have yet to walk back a single repressive edict and actually only continue to get more brutal to women and other minority populations, it is well overdue for the international community to lean really hard into a number of mechanisms that haven't been tried. And at the end of the day, we could be right where we are today, but at least we can say we tried. And that's really where I think, advocates and experts need to push. And there are a lot of ways to put financial pressure on the Taliban that haven't yet been utilized.
You're absolutely right. I am asked quite often, well, what do you think should happen? And as a journalist for a long time, I thought, well, it's not my job. But then I thought, I'm a human being and I'm a woman, and there but for the grace of God go I. And so I started to think about the things that I know of that are on the table. We know that a lot of the Taliban leadership have overseas nationalities. They send their children abroad. Their girls go to school abroad. Their families live in other countries. Let's put a stop to all that. Let's deport the families back to Afghanistan. Let's not allow them to send their girls to school if other girls can't go to school. Let's cancel their foreign passports. And then there's the Magnitsky laws, which are on the books of just about every country that I could reel off in a minute and a half, including the 3 of which I am a citizen. And yet when I was detained and my human rights abused by the Taliban, I contacted a human rights lawyer to pursue at least the possibility of doing something about it, according to the Magnitsky-style laws that exist quite broadly, and nothing came of it. So would you mind explaining your understanding of Magnitsky laws and how they could be applied to named officials of the Taliban? I mean, I did consider emailing the FBI and saying, I know where Sirajuddin Haqqani is. Can I have the $10 million reward, please? I mean, nothing has been done. So let's start there. What are the Magnitsky laws? And then how do you think they could be applied?
So the Global Magnitsky Act, as it's known in the United States, is legislation that exists within well over 30 countries, right? Including the EU itself, and then obviously has a trickle-down effect into all EU member states. And essentially, it aims to undermine the travel and financial assets of individual perpetrators of gross human rights abuses, corruption, and kleptocracy. And so there are lists that exist, right, in the United States and all of these other countries that have Magnitsky law in the books. For those who want to know more about its origins, Bill Browder's your guy, his book Red Notice, and so much else that he's written and advocated for. It's named actually after his lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who was murdered Putin and the Russian regime. And, it has been utilized in so many cases against cartels and extremists and, organized crime leaders and the like, bad actors.
In Russia, in China,
yes,
in
yes.
Myanmar, across the
Yes.
board. So then the question is, why not the Taliban, and how could that be done?
Exactly. Lynn, it's exactly that, right? And what is interesting, so two things with Magnitsky. One, to my knowledge, it is yet to be used specifically against perpetrators of gross women's rights abuses, right? So yes, you can argue that, those who are named are responsible for things like sex trafficking and gender-based violence and the like, of course, but it has never been utilized specifically to target, the persecution of women, gender apartheid, really, which we can come back to that effort as well. Two, it very rarely is used in a coordinated way, which I think hinders its impact, right? So can you imagine what a testament it would be if Magnitsky was utilized against named Taliban officials, right? And in a coordinated way across 30 plus countries. I mean, there's a lot of lip service that has been given over the last 20, 25 years to, the idea of women, peace, and security. We have resolutions at the UN, we have national legislation on the books. But, the global community fails, the US included, to mobilize that, statement of solidarity into substance. This way to demonstrate substance, and I think sends an incredibly strong message to the Taliban. It sends a strong message to other bad actors who use the persecution of women as a tool to fortify power, control, obedience, and personal profit. And it also, I think, lends a lot of gravitas to the effort being led by Iranian and Afghan women to codify and criminalize gender apartheid within international and legal frameworks, which is essentially expanding the definition of apartheid, which to this day remains squarely reflective of racial persecution and segregation.
Yeah. Well, aside from the utilization of the Magnitsky laws, you make a whole range of recommendations. Can you run through them? And once you've run through them, let's talk about how optimistic you are about them being taken up. I mean, it's got to happen sooner or later, doesn't it?
I have hope. And, I will say this, our work at the Bush Institute, we always underscore the opportunity. There's a lot of critique in this world right now. And, you've mentioned that our reports are grounded in recommendations. And so we don't just like to unpack an issue to unpack it. We want to underscore that there is actually a roadmap forward. So some of the other recommendations that we look at, and I want to push on this, Magnitsky is part of, broader penalties that fall within the sanctions category. But even looking at the work of the 1988 committee at the United Nations, which essentially is the committee that oversees the sanctions list and the implementation of the sanctions on the Taliban. That list in and of itself has not been updated for a very long time. I mean, if you go and take a look at, the current acting minister of XYZ, to see if his name is on the UN sanctions list, it's quite likely not going to be there because the list is incredibly outdated. New officials have not been named. For example, Yaqub, who is the defense minister and also the son of Mullah Omar, is not named on that list. And that is a problem. And I'll tell you why that's a problem. So technically, the fact that you're affiliated with the Taliban should send up a red flag, right? When it comes to international travel. That's not happening. And there are multiple examples. There's a growing list, actually. I think the most well-known one is something that happened a couple months ago, which involved a WHO event at The Hague, where the head of the Food and Medicine Authority, Abdul Bari Omar, not only was able to attend the WHO events, but he was able to travel to at least 4 different European countries, right? Because he was issued a Schengen visa, right? The mechanisms that technically should have prevented him from doing so did not. But he's not on the UN sanctions list. He's not on the list that the 1988 committee oversees. And so you can see where there are these loopholes, these gaps that exist within, these robust, quote unquote, robust penalties that a lot of people think are in place. And so updating of the existing sanctions list is something that is long overdue. Likewise, why is the UN Security Council approving travel ban exemptions for Taliban leaders to travel to places like Russia and China on the dime of Russia and China to participate in bilateral discussions, business forums, summits, the like? Yep. They're also approving travel to Turkey for Taliban leaders to access medical care. Meanwhile, women can barely leave their homes. If they can, to take their sick child or themselves to a clinic, that clinic very likely is without the resources needed to support them. I mean, 167 children at least are dying every day of preventable and treatable illnesses. Meanwhile, the Taliban can go for weeks on end to Turkey to get medical care and access their personal assets, right? So, and the UN Security Council votes on this, every single exemption. But those exemptions, the information that's submitted has been described as woefully inadequate in terms of what is usually expected. And so, that's an area where we need greater scrutiny. We also need to ensure that, we've explored things like use of the U.S. Patriot Act, Section 311, which essentially would designate Afghanistan as a primary money laundering concern, which would make it far more difficult for businesses, U.S. businesses, and if other countries, did the same in terms of designation to engage in business deals with the Taliban. And I bring this up because, the Taliban are very, very keen to utilize all of the various, licit revenue streams that they now have captured to enhance themselves and enhance their hold on power. $6.5 billion, just one set of mining concessions that was signed last fall included concessions afforded to businesses in China, in Turkey, in Iran, and also 2 firms in the UK. But it wasn't illegal, right? Because the mechanisms weren't in place to prohibit, that engagement, that coordination on business deals. We also look at things like designation of the Taliban as a foreign terrorist organization. We have looked at the fact that, there are incredibly brave advocates who endure day in and day out, right? In terms of their organizations and work to educate girls in underground schools or virtual schools, or to prop up, clinics, to not just, see the independent media prevail, but to literally train citizen journalists so that the Taliban cannot continue their capture of the narrative. Those organizations are woefully underserved when it comes to accessing financial resources. They don't have access to much of, the record level aid appeal that was initiated to respond to the crisis in Afghanistan. And yet, at the end of the day, they're one of our most valuable sources of information right now. So in addition to some of the, financial penalties we also look at the need for greater support, both from public sector institutions as well as private sector philanthropic institutions towards these Afghan-led initiatives. Many of them are registered as nonprofits in places like the United States, Australia, Europe, the UK, the like. They are required to adhere to transparency and accountability mechanisms, and frankly, they're one of the greatest assets that endure in terms of pushing against just this absolute hatred and vitriol that the Taliban continue to carry forward as they exploit the Afghan state and the Afghan people.
Well, yes, indeed. But I really wonder, when the Taliban has what appear to be constructive relationships with other countries. You've mentioned Taliban officials being able to travel abroad, being given waivers on travel bans to go to business meetings in China, etc. So you've got a dozen countries with ambassadors there. You've got a growing number of countries who are, if not giving formal recognition, at least, like China and Iran, allowing a Taliban diplomatic presence, which in Kabul they take as tacit recognition anyway. So when you've got Pakistan, Iran, China, Russia, the Central Asian countries, Turkey, the Gulf states, does the rest of the world, now we've cleaved, we've seen the world cleaved between them and us. Does the Taliban care? How I keep hearing the leverage that the West has on getting the Taliban to ease up on restrictions and repression of women is we're getting closer, because what they really want is recognition, and if we make that a condition, then then it'll all work out in the end. But it's not going to work out in the end, is it? There has to be more, like you've been talking about conditions and the recommendations that you've made. But when the world is cleaved in that way between those who want to do business with the Taliban because it means they can get oil and gold and lithium and coal and whatever else, and us, our part of the world, which pretends to have standards that we'd like to hold others to, how hopeful can we be that any pressure on the Taliban is going to yield results?
It's a very fair point, and this is a difficult climb for sure. I was incredibly impressed in the summer of 2022 when, led by Ireland, right, Irish leadership, we saw an end to the blanket travel ban exemptions that were in place for Taliban leaders. So for those who may not be as familiar, after Kabul fell and the Taliban regained power, there were blanket exemptions that had existed and were extended every 60 to 90 days. And I think in many ways, people thought that, these would be, they would see, a meeting in the middle, right? Through the continuation of these exemptions. Well, of course, that didn't happen. The Taliban just got more brutal, right? And, it was the spring of 2022 that we knew first, really, look at where we are today, education, secondary, tertiary levels was not going to be an option for girls, and so many other bad things that they had done since that time. And so summer of 2022, led by Ireland said, no, we're ending, we're not allowing a renewal of these exemptions. They allowed them to expire, and they had the support of a vast majority of, UN member states. If you look at the statements of the Russians and the Chinese and what they did, obviously there's that they were passive in their statements, but they certainly were defending the Taliban in what they said and what they did. But the Taliban, you look at the response from the Taliban. Yes, they did not walk back any edicts, but they were mad and they were vocal about how irritated they were with those expiries. And so, that is one small piece of a very larger puzzle, and it irritated them, And so why are we not pursuing so many other options that exist, knowing that the Taliban continue to profit and exploit human suffering within the country, and that they have shown over the last nearly 3 years that they really are unwilling to walk back any of their positions. And so they're, yes, keen to have legitimacy because it will make exploiting the state that much easier. So why would we make it even easier for them to do so? The other thing I think I want to bring up that we haven't talked about too is it's not just, UN member states, national governments, how we exist within these multinational institutions, but there are also non-state actors who in smaller ways also enable the Taliban's pursuit of legitimacy. And so I think about the fact that, it's April, we're 3 months out at this point, really from this week, right, to the start of the Olympic Games in Paris. And the IOC still has yet to make a decision in terms of what Afghanistan's participation is going to look like. And that is incredibly concerning because if you look at the Asia Games, right, though there was an all-male team that was permitted to participate and a co-ed team sourced from the diaspora and the displaced that was allowed to participate, the Taliban still got their photo op. They still got to walk out in traditional, robes among the community of nations and get the photo op that they so desperately crave because it helps to enable their messaging back home, and it helps to project an air of legitimacy to the international community. And that is incredibly dangerous. And they're not starving. They will ride this out as long as they possibly can. So why would the international community not make it far more difficult for them to endure in the current state of play?
So it's very interesting that you mention the Olympics. As far as I know, the Australian cricket authorities, the board is called Cricket Australia, is the only sporting body in the world that has banned competition with bilateral competition with Afghanistan because of the Taliban's ban on women participating in any sort of sport. No other organisation in the world seems to care. I mean, Afghan cricket players play county cricket in the UK. And I was talking to the IOC recently, and they really don't want to. They don't want to engage on this. So Afghanistan, as they did at the Asian Games, will walk out at the head behind the host France, but at the head of the opening ceremony once again. And once again, it's a mealy-mouthed excuse, if I may say, that we encourage all people everywhere to come together with sport. But like you say, Natalie, all it's really going to do is make sure that the Taliban send a message to the home country and to all their fellow travellers that we are accepted the way we are.
And, what's been especially infuriating is, I think we just passed 100 days. The Olympic flame officially has been lit and started its journey, right, as it does every Olympic year. And, there's been I've seen a lot on social media celebrating the fact that, the participation of female athletes will be at record levels, right? And we're going to celebrate that while at the same time, women in Afghanistan, as well as, you look at what other autocratic, ideological led regimes like the Islamic Republic in Iran, have done to female athletes as well. They are enduring absolute persecution solely on the basis of gender. And it is a travesty. It's a slap in the face to all of the progress that has endured in terms of women's participation at the Olympics. I also want to bring up the fact FIFA, for example, right? And FIFA did a lot to get, female athletes who are at risk out of Afghanistan. And yet they won't allow the women's national team to compete in international competition, whether, it's bilateral, exhibition games or the like. And I believe many of them are now currently in Australia, or have in other ways. The Australian sporting bodies have allowed them to participate. Obviously it's in more of an informal capacity, but think about the message that we are sending to future generations about human rights and human dignity and what it means. And this is one of the most, whether it's the Olympics or the World Cup, these are some of the most watched sporting events in the world. And, it may not be intentional, right, to enable the Taliban, but it's certainly happening. And, this is where calling these institutions to account for their enablement, it matters immensely. And there are ways to do this that are not going to punish Afghan athletes, right? If we figured out a way to allow Russian athletes to compete, right, based on years and years of banned performance enhancing substances, and they can still compete at the Olympics, just not under their national flag. I think we can certainly find a way for Afghan athletes to compete without giving the Taliban the photo op and the unintended legitimacy that they so desperately crave, and have really latched onto. I don't know, how many of your listeners are, looking for imagery, right? But if you go to certain photo stock websites, right, to purchase images for use in, an article or a report or whatnot, what's really interesting is that the Taliban's press office is actually featured on a lot of these websites, and there is a mandatory citation that you have to include the Taliban's press office, right? Again, demonstrating like the legitimacy of their status. And what I find really interesting, though, is that they're the only ones that push out these images, right? The Chinese have yet to push out an image of Xi with the Taliban ambassador. All of this imagery is coming from the Taliban press office. And so that should send a strong warning to anybody who is keen on giving the Taliban a platform, that if you give them an inch, they're going to take a mile, and they're going to use it for propaganda purposes from day one.
But doesn't it remind you of those stories about some hotshot 27-year-old guy who was suddenly friends with everybody from J-Lo to Jeff Bezos, and had photos and selfies with them on his website to push his own prowess as a hotshot PR guy or investor or somebody, and makes millions of dollars and runs away with it, was a criminal all along, and everyone goes, yeah, we should have known. That's kind of what it's like. But also, you're talking about future generations. I really wonder about the message that I'm getting from this enabling of the Taliban's repression by organizations that my taxes go to support. I don't think it's just the girls and women of the future. I think it's the girls and women of the rest of the world, as well as Afghanistan right now. And it's not being contextualized in that way. The Afghanistan situation is being isolated so that it can be enabled, in my view. If it's just, it's just over there and it won't last long, it'll be okay. But it's not just over there. And 3 years is already far too long, and it does affect me. And I think that it also, we're seeing in America a pushback against women's physical autonomy and rights overall. So it's really quite frightening, I think, now, not just for future generations.
Absolutely. I mean, the status and well-being of women and their children all over the world, right, is at risk.
Yeah.
in today, in some form or another. And what is happening to the women and girls of Afghanistan is the most archaic example of, this rollback in rights, and agency that is playing out. And it is an absolute travesty. And it is not just, an issue that exists, over there, right? It's not my problem. It doesn't affect me in my daily life. And so I can see, right? I don't agree, but I can see how, the enablement of apathy, indifference can really take hold. And there was a huge human cost, right? In Afghanistan, sacrifices that were made. And so, I understand that. I was a senior in high school when September 11th happened. It had a considerable impact on the trajectory of my life, right? And the work I do today. But there's a lot of generations who are so removed from that, right? Like I have younger cousins who weren't even alive when September 11th happened. So, understanding the context and attributing it to your daily life is, it's difficult. It's so far removed for some, but that is why this work in using platforms of visibility, it's incredibly important. We all stand on the shoulders of giants. We all have a responsibility to one another. And if this can happen in Afghanistan, if what can happen in Iran, at the hand of the Islamic Republic against Iranian women continues to endure, I read, or over the weekend, it was announced that, right, there's a new morality unit, right, that is going to be far more, if you can even imagine, violence, let's call it what it is, in sort of their pursuit of women who defy the hijab law in Iran. If this can continue to persist, and not just persist, but get more brutal as the days pass, I mean, what hope do any of us have in terms of, the status of our rights and dignity as time goes on? And I have been so incredibly impressed with the courage, the tenacity of Afghan women who not only endure day in and day out, but at great personal risk, stand up to their oppressors. And they don't just need our solidarity, our statements of support. They need substance, and they need, the global community, democracies around the world to demonstrate that we believe just as fully in our foundational values as the Taliban believe in their, ideological manipulation and exploitation of faith in Afghan culture. And I think that, I think about the radio address that Mrs. Bush gave in November of 2001. She was the first person other than a US president to give the presidential radio address. And she used that entire opportunity to call attention to the brutality that Afghan women and girls faced day in and day out. I mean, talking about fingernails being ripped off for wearing nail polish, and just the gross violation of rights, the gender-based violence, the like, and the impact that had on, women in the United States mobilizing. I mean, it was a catalyst for the creation of U.S. Afghan Women's Council and so many incredible organizations like ARZU and others that stood up and said, I'm not just going to stand by, I'm going to educate myself, and I'm going to do something. I mean, we all have the capacity, whether it's time, talent, or treasure, to lend our support. And, far more persons of influence need to be talking about what's happening in Afghanistan. You cannot identify as a feminist and remain silent on what is happening to the women and girls of Afghanistan. But it's not just the influencers, it's literally everyone, and not just women. Like, if you have a sister, if you have a mother, if you have a daughter, if you have a grandmother, you should care about what's happening right now. And so I have hope that more will join this fight, more will push to amplify the voices and the lived experience of those who are, risking their lives to change things, not just for themselves, but for the future of their country. And amid a time where we are seeing women's rights roll back in so many capacities across the globe, it's actually Afghan women, I think, who give me the most hope, because, again, they face a grave risk in all of this. And so, that's why I continue to do this work. And I am sure a lot of this is why you continue to do this work. And hopefully, this conversation will inspire others to join us.
Well, let's hope. Your passion, Natalie, is certainly inspiring for me, because I often feel like the work that I do disappears into an ether and makes very little difference, and that can be disheartening. But the reports that you have done for the Bush Institute, and listening to you talk about it now, it is inspiring, and I'm very happy to have spent this time with you. So tell me again, so listeners can find the reports. What are they called? What's the website?
So you can find our report series, Captured State. There's 3 reports within the report series on our website, bushcenter.org. And in addition to the reports, you will see the long and very robust array of content and advocacy that we have undertaken for well over a decade in support of Afghan women, children, and other vulnerable populations. And I would be remiss, Lynn, if I didn't express my just gratitude and admiration for all of the work that you have done and continue to do. You've set such an incredible foundation and so tirelessly, push forward on this day in and day out. So I would be remiss if I didn't extend my gratitude to you as well.
Well, thank you, Natalie. That's very, very kind of you, and I'm very happy to hear that.
Thanks so much.
That was Natalie Gonnella-Platts, Director of Global Policy at the George W. Bush Institute. She talked about what's been happening in Afghanistan under the control of the Taliban. Corruption, abuse of rights, discrimination and bigotry, power for its own sake. She also talked about how the Taliban can be held to account, something not many people are willing to do. I hope you enjoyed it. Next time, I'll be joined by Mohsin Dawar, a Pakistani lawmaker and rights advocate. We'll be talking about Project Taliban, something he knows a lot about. I hope you'll join us. Until then, this is Lynne O'Donnell. Bye-bye.